Hello, and welcome back to HMR 1, Human Wrongs, Human Rights, Lecture 5. Today we're going to be following up on many of the ideas that we first raised in the discussion of the Sepulveda Las Casas debates. In particular, the, uh, the role of indigenous slavery, the enslavement of the indigenous inhabitants of North and South America, as a catalyst for thought in Western Europe about the human wrongness of slavery itself and efforts undertaken to end it. And as we know from our discussion from the last lecture, the new laws of Spain ended indigenous slavery. But as I noted, that was almost a hollow victory, if you will, because by the time King Charles of Spain had banned indigenous slavery, indigenous people as a viable source of labor, of slave labor for Spanish and then also Portuguese colonial efforts, efforts to exploit the natural resources. Indigenous people were almost no longer considered a part of that. And in part this is because extraordinarily large portions of the indigenous population had died. Up to 90% of indigenous peoples died within 2 generations of first contact with Europeans. And this has often been explained away as a feature of the virgin wilderness thesis. That the reason why so many indigenous peoples died was because they had no natural immunity to European diseases. So, we're living through a pandemic right now. We understand what a new disease can do to us. And something to think about is it actually killing 90% of us? Smallpox, which was the disease that was responsible for killing many indigenous people during this period, at its very worst can only kill about 30% of a population. In fact, populations develop herd immunity and they recover. But I encourage you to look at a graph in your Slack, and it shows us an image of young Aram Watanpa, whom you've grown to know and love, pointing at a map that he and I found during a trip to Washington, D.C. about 4 years ago. A graph showing the decline of the indigenous population of our state over a roughly almost 300-year period, ending in the year 1900. So 1900, that population curve began to recover and sort of dance around at a very low level, and then only in the last few decades has begun to recover. So what's useful about this sign is it tells us, yes, disease had played a role in the destruction of indigenous peoples, but also other things, the destruction of the environment, the forcing of people from their land. And in the case of California, it's estimated that most indigenous people died because of murder. They were killed either by the state or state agents in the period after the gold rush of 1849. So the story is much more complicated than just disease coming in, killing lots of people, and then the Europeans taking over. But we have to ask ourselves why that story is so durable, why this idea of a virgin wilderness is such a durable story in the history of colonialism, which is the next unit we'll study, but also in our understanding of enslavement in the New World. And part of it I think is that the story that colonialism likes to tell about itself, especially in the New World and in places like Australia, is the land was empty, right? And the European settlers were people for a land without people. In other words, there was no one there. They weren't using it. There were so few people. It would have been, it was virgin forests. And this completely misunderstands the fact that large numbers of indigenous peoples in inhabited areas had brought it under agricultural use, that there were established political networks and national ideas about sort of political entities and political organization. All of this we saw in the discussion of the ideas raised by Las Casas in trying to establish the fact that the Indians had civilization, that they had, that they were capable of reason. In other words, this was a way to further deny the humanity or membership in humanity of the indigenous peoples. But it also, what it does, by focusing on disease almost entirely, to quote David Stannard, who's a very important scholar in the study of genocide, and genocide is something we'll also be talking about later, and we have an entire course at UC Davis dedicated to its study. Genocide is an attempt to eliminate a people as a people. And he argues, quote, by focusing almost entirely on disease, contemporary authors increasingly have created the impression that the eradication of those tens of millions of people was inadvertent, a sad but both inevitable and unintended consequence of human migration and progress. And he concludes by arguing that destruction was neither inadvertent nor inevitable, but the result of microbial pestilence and purposeful genocide working in tandem. In other words, had other measures, right, of exploitation, enslavement, murder, destruction of the environment, destruction of political culture, destruction of sort of the culture of indigenous peoples, had that not been there and been part of colonial policies, the disease would have been terrible, but it wouldn't have led to the near elimination entirely of indigenous groups. As Andres Resendez, who's our colleague here at UC Davis, argues, among the human factors, slavery has emerged as the major killer of indigenous peoples. So when we think about slavery as a human wrong, in the case of North and South America, it's not just a human wrong, I don't want to say in abstract, but in the theory of owning other people is wrong. What was also wrong about slavery in the New World, slavery in what we call the Columbian encounter, is that slavery was part and parcel of the destruction of the indigenous peoples of the New World. So, one thing we have to ask ourselves as we move forward is why keep teaching this idea of the naturalness of extermination. I was just looking at a recent National Geographic on pandemics, says exactly that about the destruction of the indigenous people. But regardless, this created a labor shortage. And one of our thesis statements is this idea that slavery exists where it makes economic sense. Right? So without indigenous people, it was very hard to exploit labor. So there was a need to seek out other opportunities for labor. It would have been very difficult to bring in large numbers of Europeans to do the work. It was hard, it was difficult, but also in terms of climate, parts of Central and South America resembled more parts of Africa than they did Europe. And European colonialists looked to other parts of the world where people were cultivating items like rice or indigo, or had experience in working in tropical conditions. And that took them to Africa, which was not necessarily a ready source of slaves, of people to enslave because of the local power structure in Africa, but was a possibility. And really by the beginning of the 1600s, Africans working with Europeans began to supply this market. And so what I want us to do is think about the scope and reach of this slave trade across the Atlantic, and we'll talk some about it in a moment, by looking at another wonderful graphic that just takes a couple minutes to look at. We'll look at it twice. Go into your Slack and open up the slate.com on the 1619 project, and we'll take a look at the Atlantic slave trade in 2 minutes. All right, so what does this image show us? What does this image show us? What this shows us, as we're watching, each little dot as it moves across, and you're just seeing very few at this point, each little dot, sometimes they're smaller, sometimes they're larger, is showing both the point of origin and the arrival port for a slave ship. Right? And you can see most of the slave ships are coming from West Africa, countries that are today, for example, Senegal and Gambia and Cote d'Ivoire. Right? And then others, through the course of the 17th century, others are coming from the Bight of Benin and the modern country of Angola. And if you look, almost all the boats are going to two places: the Caribbean, both the South American littoral of it, and these giant islands of Cuba and Hispaniola and Jamaica. And then another place that they were going is to Brazil in South America. So 1705, this almost looks like a super highway moving across. Faster and faster, bigger and bigger dots. The 1720s, you begin to see a few more ships making their way to North America in what will become the United States. But as you see, that graph shows the overwhelming majority of enslaved people are being taken not to North America, which was really a bit player in the larger scheme of things, but mostly to South America. As ships get bigger, as European tastes change, and with the addition of a new commodity, sugar, the numbers just explode. And it's as though the sea itself was nothing but slave ships moving through the region. The United States has been established at this point. Still, the majority are going into Cuba and South America, with a few in the United States, and pay very close attention now. Things are starting to slow down. This is the beginning of the end of the slave trade, with a political movement beginning in Great Britain called abolition or abolitionism, which led to the end of the international slave trade, and then ultimately in the enforcement of the end of the slave trade by the British, French, and other navies. And finally, the only trade occurring by the 1850s is a few ships going in and out into the Caribbean, with the last ships traversing well before the start of the American Civil War. So this is an amazing graphic, and what I don't want any of us ever to lose sight of is the sheer horror that each one of those dots represents. There were hundreds of human beings on those boats making their way across. But trying to understand the meaning of that is a real challenge we face as we think about strategies to address human wrongs. So, slavery in Africa was like slavery in other parts of the world. It was incident to war. If you made war, you could take slaves at the end of it. There was a great deal of internal slave trading in the continent of Africa, but before the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, most of that trade in humanity went from sub-Saharan Africa across the Great Sahara Desert into the Mediterranean basin, and then a great deal of slave trading that would go from the east coast of Africa, the Swahili coast of Africa, into the Indian Ocean to places like Iraq, what is today Pakistan, and India. But when the demand, but at no point during that time was the demand or the trade in human beings before the Atlantic slave trade even remotely like the amount of human beings who were being taken from Africa after it began. So the historian Patrick Manning estimates that perhaps as many, and I'm just going to throw out some numbers here, 12 million slaves were part of the slave trade between the 16th century and the 19th century, between 1500 and 1850. 1.5 million died en route, right? So that's over 10%. A little over 10 million of those slaves arrived in the Americas. Human beings also died in the process of slave raiding, and again, the political development, primarily of Western Africa, in terms of the formation of nation states, was severely damaged by the slave trade. Okay. But here's the problem with numbers. When we tried to show, we saw the dots, I've given you numbers. But there's a problem with big numbers, is that it's hard to see the human in those big numbers. And if we ever want to generate action, understanding the humanity, the human behind those numbers is very important. And so that's why now I want you to look at another image, the image of the slave ship Brooks. The slave ship Brooks. Now the slave ship Brooks image that you can see there in your Slack, I mean, this is one of the great problems of online learning, is that I don't have a chance to ask you what you see. So I'll tell you what I see. I see a cross-section of a boat, a ship with two levels, with human bodies, black human bodies, being placed shoulder to shoulder throughout the entirety of the ship. And when I see the image of those people on that ship, I grow physically uncomfortable. I've seen this image every year since I was in high school. I'm very familiar with it. I can close my eyes and I can see it. But every time I see it, I feel the discomfort. And I imagine what it would have been like, the sheer horror of what it would have been like to have been one of those people. Right? It does something to me as a person, and I can feel it. And I challenge you to see if you can feel it, not just intellectually understand it. Right? And we call that idea of the feeling that one might have when encountering an image of someone else's suffering. We call this, well, there's a fancy word for it from the 18th century, but we call this today empathy. Empathy. That you can imagine yourself in that person's position, right? But the question is, how do you connect that to some kind of action? And so we call this idea that was first noticed and written about extensively by the moral philosopher and father of modern economics, Adam Smith, Scottish, lived from 1723 to 1790. And he wrote a book entitled The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he began to try to explain why we feel this way when we see these images. And he begins his book with the following passage. Let me just read it to you. How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortunes of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it, except the pleasure of seeing it. Of this kind is pity or compassion, the emotion we feel for the misery of others, when we either see it or are made to conceive it in a very lively manner. That we often derive sorrow from the sorrows of others is a matter of fact too obvious to require any instance to prove it. For this sentiment, like all the other original passions of human nature, is by no means confined to the virtuous or the humane, though they may perhaps feel it with the most exquisite sensibility. The greatest ruffian, the most hardened violator of the laws of society, is not altogether without it. So he's writing this at a time, almost at the same time, as the emergence of the image of the slave ship Brooks. And we have to understand or begin to think about the connection between this idea of moral sentiments and why images of slave ships were circulating in British society in the 18th century. And part of it is a group of people, in which we'll talk about in the next lecture, were beginning to portray or to argue against slavery, but as part of their argument, they were seeking to appeal to what Adam Smith called moral sentiments. What they wanted to do was to quote again from from the theory of mortal sentiments, of this kind is pity or compassion, the emotion we feel for the misery of others, either when we see it or made to conceive of it in a very lively manner. If you lived in Great Britain, or even in the northern part of the United States, or Spain, or Portugal, or France in the 18th century, your direct exposure to enslaved people would have been exceedingly rare. Because as we saw from our map earlier in the lecture, these boats were not carrying people to France or to Britain. In fact, slavery in Britain had been illegal since the 1100s. We're not carrying them to Britain, to Europe. And many of them were not being carried even to North America, but we're carrying them to these faraway islands. So how could you, in the words of Adam Smith, conceive of these in a lively manner? Well, if you're just told about it, you might. But if you could see it in an image that showed the horror of the Middle Passage, you might be moved to action. So understanding the translation of emotion, of compassion, of pity, of empathy, understanding the movement of those emotions, of those sentiments, their translation into action is what we'll look at in the next lecture. Right? So just a few concluding thoughts. North and South America was not a virgin wilderness when the Europeans arrived. Instead, it was a place alive with people, with political structures, with incredibly well-developed agriculture, with deeply developed societies, with hierarchies, with culture that did terrible things to each other, but also did wonderful, wonderful things. These people may have not have had had not been exposed to many of the European diseases, but that doesn't explain why so many of them died in such a short period after the European encounter. But rather, the responsibility for their destruction should not be placed in the hands or at the feet of microbes, but rather at the feet of the colonialists who were enslaving and destroying the ecosystems of the indigenous inhabitants of the region. And finally, how can we be moved by the plight of others? How do we feel how can we be made to feel something? And then how can we translate that feeling into action? And that's a perennial question, one that we'll begin to try to answer in the next lecture.